Zack Polanski, the Green Party leader, quite famously did an article in The Sun where he brags that he could expand the size of women's breasts through the power of hypnosis alone. When he's been called out on this, he's often said that I apologised immediately, and he said quite specifically that he spoke to the BBC and said gave an effusive apology as soon as he'd done this thing. He saw the error of his ways and he wanted to repent for this sexist action. Now, as it turns out, the BBC's done a bit of digging into its archives and has discovered that actually when he did appear on the BBC not that long ago, he said he defended the practice of boob hypnosis. He said there was anecdotal evidence to suggest that this was a perfectly viable procedure and, encouraged women to have it done. I mean, Brendan, it's not the most important. There's war in the Middle East and stuff. It's not the most important subject in the world, but it is very funny to keep returning to and to keep reminding people about Polanski, the tit whisperer, and his past.
Yeah, old hypnotits. It's a brilliant story. I understand why the media likes to return to it. I'm surprised that even the BBC has gone back to it with this new revelation that he was defending himself. Yeah, it's great. It's a great story. Every now and then I have the tiny twinge of sympathy for him, and I think to myself, should we leave this story alone now and let him get on with his political career? But then I remind myself that actually, if anything, he has even crazier views about women's bodies today, because he might no longer believe that he can make a woman's breasts expand through the power of Thor, but he does believe that a man can become a woman just by declaring himself to be one. He does believe that a woman can have a penis. He does believe that if any of us three were to put on a dress and change our name, I don't know, Paula, Frazetta, or Brenda, whatever we might want to call ourselves, that we would literally be women. And we should literally have access to women-only spaces. That's actually crazier than the boob expansion stuff. So it's worth reminding ourselves that he hasn't had this Damascene conversion to realistic thinking. In fact, if anything, he's gone further down the rabbit hole of woke lunacy, if we're allowed to use those terms anymore. It just is a useful reminder that the Greens are a party of cranks. They really are a party of cranks. They believe the craziest things. And they very rarely talk about climate change anymore. They talk about trans women are women. They talk about Gaza. They talk about international issues. We saw in Gorton and Denton that I think they've thrown their lot in with Islamic conservatives in a way that I find incredibly worrying. They're a classic example of a post-class left. Because I think what happens with the left, especially the kind of middle-class left, the further it moves away from representing ordinary people, working people, the further it moves away from talking about issues of work and pay and conditions and the right of working people to be paid well and to live well, and instead embraces all these kind of eccentric ideas that land well in polite society but nowhere else. The more they do that, the madder they become. And I think the Greens are a classic example of what happens when the so-called left leaves the plane of reason and flies up into this kind of new eccentric way of thinking. So from hypnotits to trans women are women, there is a logical journey of lunacy in what Zack Polanski's been up to these past few years.
And Paul, sometimes, as Brendan was saying, you might feel sorry for someone who's having a historical, say, faux pas being tread over and over again. But you could see that he's the kind of person that would absolutely milk this if it was one of his political enemies. One thing that suggests this perhaps is the fact that he's probably one of the only public figures that was crazy enough to defend the arrest of Graham Linehan after he touched down in Heathrow last year, when he was arrested for tweeting that you should punch a woman in the balls. So he's clearly not a friend of free speech, or he's not himself so tolerant.
No, I'm still thinking about Brendan's statement of me putting a dress on and calling myself Paula. I've got a feeling he's been looking at my personal diary, I think. I'm generally not in favour of attacking people over things that they happen to have said and done many years ago. We see that quite a lot nowadays, don't we? Where, people or organisations or media trawl for old statements on social media and so on. But I think the difference here, two things. First of all, he's the leader of what is certainly becoming an emerging political party, which is having a bit of an influence on the national stage. And consequently, I think, you can actually hold people to account when they have that level of influence for things that they may have said and done in the past. And secondly, he and the Greens generally, and actually many people on the radical left, are so high-minded when it comes to some of this stuff, very quick to throw accusations at other people. You're a racist, you're a sexist, you're a misogynist. So, I mean, it's almost perfect, isn't it, when you get a leader of a party from that part of the spectrum, which, somebody who engaged in this kind of dodgy practice, said to women that they could grow their boobs just through hypnotism. And there was a picture of him in the sun, actually sitting there in an armchair, staring, I think, in quite an uncomfortable way, a woman's boobs. Then you can actually understand why people say, we will dredge this up and we will criticize you for it. If he's able to expand things just by looking at them, I'd like him to have a look at my bank balance, to be perfectly honest. But Brendan touched on it in terms of, look, the Greens cannot be taken seriously for as long, first and foremost, for various reasons, but first and foremost, any political party that says a woman can have a penis and says that actually, there is no such thing scientifically as a man or a woman. It's entirely for individuals to define themselves what they are. They don't deserve to be taken seriously. And I've seen him give interviews where he said that actually he has no problem with men entering women's sporting competitions and so on. I don't think these people realize just how fringe that view is out there in mainstream society. It might be an accepted view within the upper echelons of our increasingly woke institutions and parties on the left, but actually out there in wider society, it really isn't. And I think that alone kind of disqualifies him and the Greens from ever holding power in this country. And also, I think the open borders position. I mean, they'd say that they don't have an open borders position, but I think when you look at their pronouncements over immigration, it's pretty clear that they're in favour of the most liberal immigration policies, and actually have got no idea of what that's caused in terms of, over the years in this country, in terms of the economic impact in certain sectors and certain communities, and some of the social tensions and the impacts on social cohesion that we've seen. They are completely either oblivious to it or just unwilling to accept that this is true. And you see what they did in Gorton and Denton, I think, is testament to the fact that they just don't understand some of these deep lying issues going on in our country. So no, they cannot and do not deserve to be taken seriously.
Yeah, don't stop talking about the boats, talk about the yachts is the Green Party line. It's all a big distraction by billionaires, when actually, of course, this is an issue that affects the poorest people in society much more than anyone else. I mean, there is just thinking about some of the green policies, there is just a jumble of kind of contradictions and crankishness. I mean, they have a policy of legalizing all drugs, but also banning tobacco. This week they came out with, we want to put everyone should have a dog license. You should have a license. You need a license to own a dog. They say they're for the working class, but they're opposed to basically all industry. They're for open borders, but actually opposed to cheap air travel and people having foreign holidays. So go to Spain on a dinghy maybe is their answer for your trip to Marbella. But Brendan, finally, and is there anything you want to say on the just the sort of crankishness of the Greens? I mean, it is actually kind of amazing that this party is taken seriously by sections of the media as a kind of credible left alternative, either to Labour or as the kind of second coming of Corbynism. I mean, you almost yearn for the Corbyn years as a haven of sensibility, sensibleness and sanity compared to this project, I think.
Well, yeah. Well, at least Jeremy Corbyn was against the European Union until he wasn't, because he was under so much pressure from these Oxbridge twats in the Labour Party that he kind of buckled in the end. The Greens, the thing about the Greens, they are an objectively anti-working class party. That's the thing. Everyone was going on about Hannah Spencer, who's their new MP for Gorton and Denton, saying she's a plumber, she's an ordinary woman. you know, fair play to her. Society needs plumbers. They do an incredibly important job, but I don't particularly care what her job used to be. The fact is, the Greens are objectively anti-working class. All of their policies, I think, would hurt working class communities. You know, right from their opposition to industry, their opposition to oil exploration, coal mining, the development of nuclear, all of these things that would create thousands and thousands of well-paying jobs. Their open borders approach, we know that this kind of influx of migrants, both illegal and recently legal as well, has had a detrimental impact on working class communities more than any other community. And their social policies, you know, just incredibly chilled out, it seems, about the destructive consequences of certain social policies on rundown communities. They seem not to care about that stuff. So, yeah, I just think crankishness, but a crankishness that hurts one section of society in particular. And you just long for the old Green Party. Remember when it was just this kind of, you know, middle-aged women in the home counties, nothing wrong with middle-aged women in the home counties, by the way, who loved trees and wanted to fix the ozone layer and were worried about acid rain and all this stuff, which never really floated my boat, but, you know, let them crack on with it. You kind of pine for the days when the Green Party were just a bunch of muesli eating kind of middle class, slightly elderly people. Now they've been replaced by these cranks. So it's a depressing sign of the times, I think.